Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the program we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that you can go into the conversations with your neighbor, knowing the facts and the background of all these stories, and we'll give you both sides so you can compare fairly with it. Executive Director of the Honest Elections Project, Jason Snead, is back on the program. Can't imagine there being any issues with elections this year. Jason, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well, thank you, and thank you for having me.
Not at all. I've used the term gaslit frequently, but no more than the issue of voting, mail-in ballot, absentee ballot, absentee no witness ballots. The gaslighting that has gone on regarding this November's election has perhaps raised the bar to levels we never thought we'd ever be able to see on a public policy stand. How can we even hold an election? I mean, I know it's really going to happen, but is there going to be a result in time for January of next year by the time all the lawsuits finish getting filed?
Well, I certainly hope so. This is clearly going to be the most unusual election that most of us have experienced. In fact, I would say that all of us have experienced. Mm-hmm. And there is probably going to be a lot of litigation in tight races, whether that's presidential level contests or House, Senate, governor's races, because of all of the absentee ballots that are going to be cast this year and all of the problems that are going to flow from that decision to move large chunks of our electorate to a vote-by-mail system. Now, the concern is obviously, is this litigation going to substantially delay the results of the election? Is it going to cast doubt on the legitimacy of those results? And I think that will obviously remain to be seen, but there is a much clearer chance of that happening this year in this election because of all of the reasons that we've discussed with the COVID pandemic and all of the changes that are being made as a result of that, for this to be a much dragged out process. And I'd say it's fairly safe to say that on both sides of this issue, on the left and the right, there are large segments of voters who are primed and ready to doubt the legitimacy of the results if their side loses. So this is a very contentious situation, and I think it has to be handled delicately and appropriately by elected officials and by our political leaders on all sides.
Well, let me jump from that because I'm sticking pins frantically in all the things you're saying, Jason, because I want to circle back to but that one specifically, as the Pew Research Center told us, 58% of poll workers surveyed don't want to do it this year. Don't want to do it, don't want to be involved in it, don't want to be exposed to COVID-19. In a time when being a poll worker is as hypercritical as it's ever been, we've lost more than half of them.
Well, that is a significant problem. And I want to say at the outset that I, of course, understand why a lot of the poll workers who traditionally work these elections are not coming back this year. I mean, we understand that these folks are typically older, and as a result of that, they fall into the higher risk categories for COVID-19. And so right now, the challenge that most states are being confronted with is, how do we fill that gap? What do we need to be doing in order to get poll workers on scene on Election Day to make sure that we can open polling places? That's going to be critically important. And we're seeing some states put much more emphasis and effort into this than others. For instance, the state of Ohio is unrolling some really creative solutions to try to entice and incentivize young people and non-traditional poll workers to come out. They're even offering lawyers CLE credits so that they're getting some sort of additional compensation for their time to work those polls. But that's going to be important because there are going to be millions of voters who are going to have either a desire to vote in person or have no choice but to vote in person. We have to give them options to do that as well.
That's an interesting and cost-effective way of doing it, to say simply, by doing this, like the way a lot of our EMTs are staffed with medical students who get credit for their volunteerism at some of these fire departments and EMS locations. That's a very compelling way to do it. Is Ohio the only one who really has kind of opened that thought up?
I'm not sure that there are other states that have gone that far. certainly there are states that are trying to find additional poll workers, and they're doing other sorts of programs.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are states that are not, and those are states that are much too quick, I think, to throw in the towel and insist that we have to move to a vote by mail type of a system. I would contrast the more creative and energetic solutions that Ohio is seeking with the way that many of Maryland's election officials have handled the situation. For instance, when Governor Hogan announced that the election was going to be an otherwise normal election compared to the all vote by mail primaries, where he insisted that all polling places be open so that you don't have the problems with long lines and voter confusion on Election Day that you had in the primaries. The response from a lot of the elections officials and then concerns at the State Board of Elections level was that they weren't going to be able to staff the polling places. And I think that they threw in the towel too quickly there. And there, might have been some political undertones to those sorts of arguments. I think that we need to be at this point in the process not asking, how do we have a successful vote by mail election? We need to be asking, how do we have a successful election? And that means that we need to have policy changes that not only allow for voters to request absentee ballots if they're particularly vulnerable or susceptible to COVID-19, but we also need to be making sure that we are giving voters safe in-person voting options. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, the narrative that in-person voting is inherently dangerous and must be significantly reduced in scale or scope because of fear of COVID-19 has been roundly debunked at this point. And so I think that as states are looking honestly at what their capabilities and capacities are, they need to be opening polling places to reduce the demand on an untried absentee ballot voting system.
I suggested we deputize all the supermarkets for Election Day, since they seem to be able to pull it off. Jason Snead is on with us, Executive Director of the Honest Elections Project and Executive Director there. And I want to go back to another point about this election. And, you talk about legitimacy. In 2008, this was an issue with mail-in ballots from military servicemen here in Central Virginia. The military ballots didn't arrive in time. They had been mailed in time, but the legal challenges went on while the TV cameras recorded one candidate saying he believes every valid vote should be counted. His lawyers were in court saying, well, they didn't get here in time, you can't count them, changing the course of that election. Is that the kind of thing we're going to see? Because that was so horribly divisive, especially when it was involving people who really had very little control over whether their ballots came in on time because they went out on time.
Well, I do think that we're going to be seeing challenges in court over that exact issue. There are lots of questions when you are voting absentee about how your ballot is actually going to be counted and whether your ballot is going to be counted. And there are lots of pitfalls between you, the voter, and the ballot box and being counted that your ballot could trip and fall into and then be rejected. So it could be rejected because it arrives after a statutory deadline. It could be rejected because your signature does not match a signature on file. It could be rejected if the voter neglects to fill out the portions of the ballot where you have to get a witness or provide some sort of other identification to satisfy the state's interest in making sure that the voter who is casting that ballot is who they say they are. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there are other problems, technical problems with the ballot itself that could lead to it being rejected. Sometimes voters will inadvertently overvote or undervote, which means that they either forget to vote for a candidate for a particular race or they vote for too many candidates for the same race. These are the sorts of concerns that can be dealt with easily at a polling place, but prove fatal if you're voting by mail. And so I do think that we're going to be looking at the potential for litigation if there is a tight race where the margin for victory is smaller than the number of ballots that have been rejected for any of those reasons. It will be, I think, very similar to the hanging chads and pregnant chads that marked the Bush v. Gore 2000 recount in Florida, but you'll see it over signature matching, postmarking, ballot deadlines, and you could see it anywhere in the country this year.
Yeah, the phrase "selected, not elected," comes to my mind, and he's not my president. I can imagine that writ large across the entire country. Really a frightening scenario, Jason. Now, one of the things you've done up till this point, you helped the Heritage Foundation develop its election fraud database, and I'm keying in on that bit of your history because a lot of our listeners are going to be confronted with people who have heard the media narrative that stories of voter fraud are bunk, fake news. People are having their posts on Facebook taken down over them. I've been involved in issues. We had a case here in Louisa County, Virginia, where a worker at a retirement home harvested all the votes of the elderly residents and mailed them all in for the same candidate. He's in prison now, but the fact is that it happened. Give a little something to the listeners so that they understand, or a resource for them to be able to counteract those dismissals of concerns over voter fraud?
Well, I'll say at the outset that we know that voter fraud is real, and we know that its impact can be significant. There's this myth that gets perpetuated that voter fraud either doesn't exist, or if it does, until you get to a point where you could swing a presidential election with millions of illegal ballots, that it's a simple non-issue and that we don't need to be taking steps to stop it. But we know, again, that is not true. There are lots of races, particularly at the state and local level, that are decided by a small handful of votes. And so in those sorts of races, sometimes you only need one illegal ballot to be cast to swing the outcome of an election. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we don't have to look very hard or very far back in our history to see elections that have been overturned because of fraud. In Paterson, New Jersey, this year, now, there is an unfolding voter fraud scandal where a judge just ordered that the May municipal election be redone because the results were so tainted by widespread fraud that caught up a serving city councilman and someone who was running for and ultimately purportedly won that race for a seat on the city council. And there are lots of instances like that. Folks that want to see plenty of clear examples of voter fraud of all sides should go to the Heritage Foundation's database. I did help set that up, and it is a one-of-a-kind resource where people can see real examples of fraud. And, one thing that I will say about this narrative that the problem of voter fraud is not at a national scale, so therefore we don't need to worry about it. Well, part of the reason for that is that we have safeguards in place. Right? We have laws that are designed to make voter fraud difficult to perpetuate, and that helps to protect the sanctity of the process and the legitimacy of the democratic process. Take those rules away, as the left frequently argues in legislatures and in court to do, and you open the door to fraud. So it's a bit like saying, if I own a bank, as long as I've never been robbed, I can probably get rid of my security guard. I can get rid of the security cameras. I don't need a vault anymore. No one thinks that's an acceptable or common sense sort of a solution, but that's what they're arguing for in the voter fraud context.
Well, and from that, you wind up circling back to in-person voting. I find that just as a matter of sociology, we're less likely to, let's just use the phrase, bear false witness if we have to look somebody else in the eye and do it. Whereas if we get to, for example, here in Virginia, we no longer have the witness signature requirement for absentee ballots. So if somebody like this fellow in Louisa at the retirement home wanted to, now he doesn't even need a co-conspirator to, quote, witness the ballot. They just send him in. And I feel like it's not a perfect scenario, but being in person with somebody makes it a little harder to lie to, or the percentages of the population capable of just lying to somebody's face diminishes quite a bit.
Well, I think that's probably right. And then, of course, it also introduces another layer of security to the system. And that layer of security helps to make fraud more difficult. Fraud is possible in any election with any set of rules. But the question is, do you have rules in place that help to make it more difficult and then more easily identifiable after the fact? The Paterson, New Jersey case that I mentioned, for instance, involved potentially thousands of mail-in ballots that were potentially harvested, tampered with, altered. The full facts of that are still coming out. But one of the ways that this fraud was so quickly identified was because you found hundreds of ballots stuffed together in mailboxes, despite a state law that says that ballot harvesting is limited to 3 ballots per person. And the other way that they caught it was in a signature match program where some signatures that the voters provided on the ballots didn't match signatures on file. Mm-hmm. And so those are two safeguards that allowed elections workers to very quickly identify ballots that may have been fraudulent, may have been tampered with, and then to uncover this attempt to steal an election. But those rules, those sorts of verifications are increasingly under attack in part of this push by the left to move the U.S. not only to an all vote-by-mail system, but a vote-by-mail system that is characterized with few, if any, significant or substantive safeguards that allow you to detect that fraud after it occurs. That, by definition, is an unnecessary step, because if you can go to a grocery store, if you can do all of these sorts of interactions that we're doing right now in society, why would we not be able to ask a friend to witness a ballot? That just does not make sense. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we're sort of sacrificing those safeguards that help to keep the system secure for no good reason whatsoever.
Jason Snead, Executive Director with the Honest Elections Project, and you can find him online there. And please follow and help them out, do the work that they're doing, because it is quantifiable and it's real. You mentioned grocery stores. You mentioned a lot of the other interactions that we have. Where is the sweet spot? I want to go forward from this a little bit and puzzle over technology versus privacy, and how perhaps we can come up with a solution to our voting issues, whether it's a QR code or are there ways to come up with a digital thumbprint that can verify without making a third or fourth party aware of who you voted for, so the secret ballot is protected, your identity is protected, and your ability to vote is protected?
Well, this is the $1 million question, if you
billions,
will,
probably,
because we obviously live in a digital society. We obviously use apps and smartphones and the internet for a substantial amount of our commerce, and we have banking online. So Americans are clearly not averse to doing some very personal things on the internet. But one of the things that we prize and treasure in the voting context, and you hit on this perfectly, is the notion of the secret ballot. There's an expectation of privacy there, and it's for very good reason. You want to protect the ability of people to be able to vote the way that they actually want to, rather than the way that maybe their neighbor or their spouse or their union representative wants them to. And that makes voting over the internet or using additional sorts of technology in that space much more difficult. Now, states have found some ways to do, for instance, barcodes with mail-in ballots, particularly the vote-by-mail states like Washington, so that you can quickly identify a ballot that's been mailed out and then invalidate that ballot if it gets lost, that sort of a thing. But in terms of moving ever further down the path of digital voting, I'm skeptical that we're going to get there anytime soon, because I think that trying to reconcile the inherently public nature of the internet with the private nature of voting is going to be a very difficult one to be able to reconcile.
Well, you're speaking to somebody who discovered one year that somebody had stolen his Social Security number, supposedly, one of the most private things that we have. So, it does happen. Last one for you, Jason. On the subject of mail-in balloting, aside from all of the demagoguery that's going on regarding the U.S. Postal Service, one of the things I think is left out in this is they'll point to a place like Washington that votes by mail, and they say, well, they vote by mail all the time, Joe. What are you so concerned about? It's not the vote by mail by itself I try to make the case that it's vote by mail without a verification of the voter rolls. I was told not to use the word purge because communist countries use the word purge. But going through the voter rolls and verifying that the people who are on the voter rolls are still alive, still residents. We've had research done that have shown tens of thousands of Virginians that are registered in 2 and sometimes 3 other states because they move around. And some of them may still be in Virginia, but some of them aren't. Can we get to a place without hearing the left screaming about poll taxes and vote suppression just to verify each voter? And how would we do it well so that we can satisfy both sides that if we're going to do mail-in balloting, the voter registration rolls are accurate?
Well, I definitely agree that we have to have accurate voter registration records. In fact, that's why my group is involved in litigation in Michigan right now over that exact same issue. This is important in any election, but it's obviously particularly important if you're going to be talking about trying to rush into or move into a vote-by-mail system where you have to have accurate records of who is a qualified voter in your state and where they live. That just is basic common sense. But this question of cleaning up the voter rolls, we know that they contain substantial inaccuracies and that most states are not very good at keeping them clean. We know that 10% of Americans move every year, that people die, that people are convicted of felonies that cost them their right to vote. Mm-hmm. And then those registrations aren't removed, so they just linger and accumulate on the voter rolls. That's a very significant problem if you're talking about trying to do an automatic vote-by-mail system where ballots are just sent out to every registration, because it is inevitable at that point that ballots will get sent to the wrong address. They will get sent to people who are not qualified to vote, people who may not even be alive. And then if you've also got a system that has been put in place where you don't have those other basic safeguards, those other verifications that we have talked about, signature matching, witness requirement, any sort of ID law, then you create a wide open opportunity for people to commit fraud. That's a very significant problem. So there are some states that do vote by mail and do it reasonably well, but those states spent years moving into that system, developing the infrastructure. They do much better, more aggressive list maintenance in many cases, mm-hmm. and they also have other safeguards in place. The notion that you can do all of that in what is now just a time span of a few weeks before the November election, that is malarkey, in my opinion. And it's going to set up, I think, the election this November for the sort of chaos and dysfunction that we saw in the primaries, because most states don't have the experience handling the numbers of absentee ballots that they're going to be handling this fall. So this push to move to vote by mail is an unnecessary one, since we know that in-person voting is safe, can be made safe. And it really primes the pump for chaos in November that could lead to widespread litigation and ultimately doubt over the outcome. Mm-hmm. So I tend to agree with you that pointing to the vote-by-mail states as proof that it can be done just doesn't really work in this particular context.
Right. It's not the entire story, which is sadly where we've gotten to, where everyone's telling half a story just to make a narrative. Jason, I appreciate your points with us, and really quick, we have 2 minutes here. It seems like states don't put enough effort into the bureaucracy of the Board of Elections that they do into other state permanent bureaucracies. Is that a failing? Because a lot of our poll workers are, 1 or 2 day a week employees. They just come in, they work for a couple of days, and that's it. I know we have lots of volunteer fire departments, but maybe elections need to be a more permanent part of our state operations?
Well, that's certainly an interesting idea. I think it's probably worth exploring a bit. We certainly see that there are people who work the polls, and they work very hard on election day.
Absolutely.
And I think that they do their absolute best. But there are also plenty of instances where the election system is marred by various levels of incompetence or inexperience. The state of Maryland, for instance, after its elections, their senior elections leaders were slammed by all sides, it seemed. So I do think that there perhaps needs to be a reevaluation mm-hmm. in some states, in some areas, about how well their elections are working. so that we can have, at bottom, a successful election where we get a valid result that is credible. And, the most important part of this process is convincing the people who lose that they lost. And so that means you've got to have a good system in place that works, that is accountable, that is transparent. And that is unfortunately, I think, not what we're going to have everywhere in the November election this year.
Jason, thank you so much for your time this weekend. We deeply appreciate it, and for all your work you do at the Honest Elections Project. Good luck in Michigan, and we'll hope to talk to you again very soon.
Well, thank you.
And hopefully, in a better time when we get past November, and we can look back and say, "Whew, we made it through that." But for you, enjoy the remainder of this weekend, and we will see you back here next weekend on all of our affiliate stations, YouTube channel where you find the archived programs as well. For all of us here at the Virginia Institute, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.